In the spring of 1944, in the Berlin headquarters of German intelligence, officers, peering into the flickering light of lamps, crowded around a long table buried in piles of aerial photographs, fragments of intercepted messages, and scattered intelligence reports. But their gaze did not search out the Allied offensive routes, did not study the supply lines, did not try to predict the transfer of tank divisions. All their wary energy was focused on a single figure. His name is George S. Patton. The Germans were trembling, trying to figure out where he would strike next. For months in a row, the top corporate officers of the Luftwaffe and the Abwehr distributed the best agents and equipment to spy on Patton, overshadowing even the highest rank, not for Eisenhower, who commanded all Allied forces, not for Montgomery, who chased Rommel through the North African dunes, but for this American general. No other has generated such concern among Wehrmacht analysts. The old wolf of the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, set aside a separate table in his headquarters for reports on Patton's movements, with a special light on the reports. Information about the coordinates of the Mad George was invariably marked as information of the highest urgency. Over the years, Rundstedt had tasted the bitterness of fighting the enemy's best strategists. But only one, Patton, caused him anxiety, which squeezed his chest. A clear, heavy word is fear. Patton first appeared on the horizon of the German armies in the fall of 1942, during Operation Torch. Then, in the Moroccan wind, which had not yet weathered the spicy smell of raw oranges, Patton landed the troops of the Western Strike Group. 35,000 Americans stumbled into the shifting sands of Africa, the first major land-based roar by the United States against the Axis. The German commanders squinted. They were used to taking apart the manners of enemy officers by the bones, laying out their tactics, tearing the thin threads of their psychology. But what they saw in Patton made them shiver. The movements are lightning fast, like the shadow of a hawk gliding over a flock. Where the U.S. Army was known for its slow pace, careful pumping of iron and gunpowder, Patton acted as if dynamite had been placed under his skin. 3 days later, Casablanca laid down its arms. The French officers surrendered the city almost before dawn. The Americans covered the dunes with a speed that German eyes could not even guess. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who guarded the Mediterranean spheres, demanded a detailed dossier on this stranger. Who is he? Whose spirit guides his template? What are his decisions forged from? The answers that poured onto Kesselring's desk sent a chill through the headquarters. Patton spent his entire service shrouded in wars with a German imprint. He read works in the original, walked for decades on the battlefields of the Great War, felt the ground where the German armies had once pulverized the Allies. The formations of the Prussian generals lived in his head. Patton understood the plans of the German staff better than many of Moltke's descendants. February 1943, when intercepted ciphers convey one thing: German forces under Rommel's command are collapsing at the Kasserine Gorge in Tunisia. The Americans have fallen. The first bitterness of a real catastrophe. Young soldiers abandoned their lines in unconsciousness, scattered in columns in a haze of panic. The Germans were seizing the moment. Would they see the answer? Will the enemies leave the battlefield or replace the commanders? Will they finally give up? The answer comes in March. Patton takes command of the devastated Second Corps, drained of blood, demoralized, and defeated. And a miracle of change. A little more than a dozen days later, soldiers who have acquired the rigidity of steel are standing in the same place. Those who backed away and threw rifles yesterday are now pushing hard to attack. Discipline has been restored, and a froth of confidence is building. There are signals from patrols probing German positions with saber sharpness that even proven veteran units are beginning to lose their patience. A new American rage, one that was unlike the previous slow attacks. Even the fox of the desert himself, Rommel, could not remain indifferent. In the terse lines of his diary, he admits, "The Yankees have suddenly become kinder with an animal grip. They have become much more dangerous than before. Everything has changed too quickly. Technology, replenishment are not capable of generating such a leap alone. The only key is a new leader. In the summer of 1943, it was the turn of Sicily, a gambit island stretched out like a bone to continental Italy. According to the plan, the British Eighth Army, led by Montgomery, was to move along the east coast. Patton remained in the rear, sensitively protecting the Allied flank. But Patton surged forward like a thunderstorm that had broken loose, his army flying through the west of the island, sweeping away obstacles at a pace that amazed even the Allied headquarters, not to mention the Germans. In a matter of weeks, they captured more land than any other Allied army of the war. The Germans, thoughtlessly preparing an evacuation across the thin isthmus of Messina, found themselves in a race they did not choose themselves. Patton advanced as if an invisible hand was squeezing his gates. The orange ferries were about to transport the battalions to Italy, and the American muzzle loomed on the horizon. The units leaving the island, preparing for a measured crossing of the strait, were forced to hurry. They had hours instead of days. Evacuation chaos reigned around, everything in order to have time to slip out before the inevitable tick. And Patton, like an old horse racing winner, got to Messina earlier than Montgomery, despite starting from the far shore. 200 miles in 39 days, and under fire all the time. In the analytical reports of the Wehrmacht, phrases oozed with a mixture of professional delight and sincere anxiety. One of the reports says, "This man fights battles like a Panzerkommandant, and the German tactics of lightning warfare are closer to him than the slow maneuvers of the Allies. He took risks that the Americans rejected, racking the brains of his opponents before they had time to reorganize." His thoughts were close to the German military school. And that's the whole threat. August 1943. The peak of glory. General Patton, literally soaked in the smoke of gunpowder and gunfire, visits 2 evacuation hospitals in Sicily. Patton intervened like a lightning bolt in the wards, saturated with the smell of blood and alcohol. There were soldiers lying on their beds, crushed by the invisible yoke of war. Fear paralyzed their souls. For Patton, these were not warriors, but fugitives who left their comrades to die under the German barrage. He raised his hand and a loud slap fell across the soldier's face. A week later, the second incident occurred more harshly. He pulled out a pistol and thundered a threat right through the vestibule of the hospital. The rumors spread like a curse across Sicily. They reached the headquarters, to the ears of Eisenhower himself. He fumed. He could barely restrain himself from completely dismissing the general. The newspapers were full of noise. "Patton is not worthy to command! Shame on the motherland!" The legislators demanded an immediate arrest. The German intelligence officers did not miss a word. They closely followed the scandal. They saw that the man they were hunting could be forced out of the game not by them, but by the hands of enemies. It was probably their little victory. But Ernest Eisenhower first threatened him, but did not expel him. He left it as a hidden weapon for the future. The German command was worried again. If such a person is being held, it means they are preparing for the great bet. The beginning of 1944. Patton is out of active combat, wandering the rainy morning hills of England. The Germans watched him relentlessly, sending reports almost by the hour. They knew he was here. They knew that he was not in charge of any combat group preparing for the expected invasion. Then what's the point of this silence? The conclusion comes: Patton is the head of the advancing shock army. Of course. The Americans would not have thrown their best player into the substation of war. Where Patton is, that's where the outcome will be decided. They did not suspect the main thing. The first group of the American army was a ghost. A soap bubble inflated with radio intercepts, fakes, inflatable tanks and fake headquarters made of painted plywood. All the striking power was just an illusion, behind a showcase of empty radio sets and rubber Shermans. The grandiose hoax of the war was based on one thing, on the faith of the Germans, Patton, wherever he was, would lead the armies to where the storm would break. The commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, caught up in anxiety, becomes a prisoner of his own faith. Everything indicated that the main attack would be at Calais, the shortest section across the English Channel. Elite reserves flocked there, cement bunkers and cannons rushed there. There they were greeted by the ghost of Iron George. June 6, 1944. The Allied fleet landed on the beaches of Normandy, 1.5 miles southwest of the direction expected by the Germans. Everything that Hitler had been sharpening his teeth for so many years came suddenly and obliquely, causing the German generals to freeze like spiders in the wind. Is this the main blow? Or is it a clever maneuver to lure the tanks away from the real danger, and is Patton about to send an avalanche through Calais? Field Marshal Rundstedt was eager to throw tank divisions to the sea to sweep away the invaders. But the order was never received. Hitler and his entourage doubted, what if it was a hoax? And Patton's blow will follow tomorrow, where it has been expected for so long. And for 6 crucial weeks, the thunderous steel divisions, capable of squeezing the invasion beaches in a steel fist, stood motionless, shackled by doubts. The enemies were prisoners of Patton's ghost. They couldn't believe it. The Americans wouldn't let George Patton get caught up in the middle of the decisive battle of the entire war. August 1, 1944. Patton finally received a combat command. He took control of the 3rd Army and entered the fighting in Normandy. The Germans had been waiting for him. Now he was here and he was about to prove every fear they had about him was justified. In the first 2 weeks of August, 3rd Army covered more ground than any Allied force had managed in 2 months of fighting. Patton's divisions raced through Brittany, then swung east toward Paris. German units that had held defensive lines for weeks, suddenly found Americans behind them, cutting their supply routes, threatening their headquarters. The German command structure in western France collapsed. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Orders contradicted each other. Commanders didn't know where the front was because Patton kept moving it. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as the senior German commander in the West, sent increasingly desperate reports to Berlin. The American Third Army was everywhere. Every time German forces tried to establish a defensive line, Patton was already past it. The situation was out of control. By mid-August, Patton saw an opportunity that could end the war in France in a single stroke. German armies were retreating through a narrow gap near the town of Fallet. If Allied forces could close that gap, they would trap hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Patton pushed north toward Files while Canadian and Polish forces pushed south. The pocket tightened. German units inside began to panic. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles and tried to escape on foot. Officers lost control of their men. The destruction was catastrophic. German losses in the Files pocket exceeded 50,000 captured and perhaps 10,000 killed. Equipment losses were even more devastating. The German army in France lost most of its tanks, artillery, and transport. German officers who survived the pocket later described it as worse than Stalingrad. At least at Stalingrad, they said, there was time to prepare. Patton gave them no time at all. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals extensively. They asked about Allied commanders. Which ones did you respect? Which ones did you fear? The answers were remarkably consistent. Montgomery was predictable, the Germans said. He was methodical and careful. He always knew what he would do next. That made him easier to fight. Bradley was competent, but cautious. He didn't take risks. German commanders could anticipate his movements and prepare defenses accordingly. But Patton was different. German generals used words like unpredictable, aggressive, and dangerous. Field Marshal Rundstedt said. Patton was the Allied general they most feared. General Fritz Berlin, who commanded the Panzerlehr Division, said Patton was the only Allied commander who had the instincts of a German panzer leader. The Germans respected Rommel because he was bold and unconventional. They found those same qualities in Patton. He didn't fight by the book. He made decisions faster than his opponents could react. He understood that war was about speed and shock and violence, not careful planning and overwhelming force. Rundstedt put it simply. Patton, he said, was the most dangerous man they faced. December 1944. Germany launched its last major offensive of the war. A massive attack through the Ardennes forest that caught Allied commanders completely by surprise. Within days, American forces were in retreat. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne. The situation was desperate. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. He asked his commanders how quickly they could counterattack. Most generals talked about weeks of preparation. Moving armies was complicated. They needed time. Patton said 48 hours. He could attack in 2 days with 3 divisions. The other generals thought he was grandstanding. It was impossible. You couldn't turn an army 90 degrees and attack on a completely different axis in 48 hours. The logistics alone would take weeks. But Patton had already prepared. His intelligence officer Oskar Koch had predicted the German attack when everyone else dismissed the possibility. Patton had quietly developed contingency plans. When the attack came, he was ready. Patton made one phone call. Within hours, Third Army began its pivot north. More than 250,000 men, tens of thousands of vehicles in winter conditions across icy roads in 48 hours. The Germans couldn't believe it. They had expected weeks before any serious counterattack. Instead, Patton was already hitting their southern flank. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies was stopped. After the war, German generals were asked about the Battle of the Bulge. What went wrong? Many of them gave the same answer. They hadn't expected Patton to respond so fast. They thought they had more time. They never learned. From the first day they encountered him in North Africa to the last day of the war, the Germans underestimated how fast Patton could move. And every time they paid for it. So why did German generals fear Patton more than any other Allied commander? Because he thought like them. German military doctrine emphasized speed, aggression, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The blitzkrieg that conquered Poland, France, and nearly Russia was built on these principles. German commanders understood this kind of warfare instinctively. Patton understood it, too. He had studied German tactics for decades. He had internalized their philosophy of war. When he commanded an army, he fought the way German generals wished. They could fight. But there was something else. German commanders could predict what most Allied generals would do. They knew the American and British military systems. They understood the doctrine, the caution, the reliance on overwhelming firepower before advancing. Patton didn't follow the rules. He attacked when doctrine said to defend. He advanced when logistics said to halt. He took risks that his superiors considered reckless and his enemies considered terrifying. The Germans never knew what Patton would do next. They only knew it would be fast. It would be violent, and it would cost them. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the man who had commanded German forces on D-Day, who had fought the best generals the Allies had to offer, summarized it after the war. Patton, he said, was the supreme master of mobile warfare. He was a brilliant practitioner of offensive tactics, and he was the Allied general the Germans feared the most. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of the Ardennes, George Patton earned that fear, one battle at a time, one impossible victory at a time, until the German generals who had conquered Europe learned what it felt like to face a commander who fought exactly like they did, only better.